Something happened on July 2nd, 2026 that really turned conventional wisdom about renewables on its head. Then, on July 8th, just 6 days later, something else happened that I think is even more exciting. And both of these things were so significant, I'm making a video about them, especially because I haven't actually seen anyone acknowledge this angle of what happened on July 2nd. Specifically, that on July 2nd, solar power saved the PJM grid, the biggest grid in the country, from a reliability crisis caused by coal and gas power plants. For those of you who don't know, just to get this out there, PJM is an organization that operates the biggest grid in the country. It's 13 states from Virginia Beach to Chicago. And their coal and gas fleet endangered the reliability of our grid, and solar saved it. This is the opposite of the lies that Trump and the fossil fuel industries like to tell, but it's what happened. So let's dive into it. I'm Jamie DeMarco. This is Maryland Energy Talk. On July 2nd, 2026, the PJM region experienced a record-smashing heat wave. Specifically, between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. that day, the grid hit an all-time high energy demand. With one important caveat, which we will get into later, but all-time high. The previous record for an all-time high was 20 years ago. And first of all, that surprised me. I would have assumed that with all the data centers coming online, with Northern Virginia being the data center of the world, there's no higher concentration of data center usage anywhere. 25% of all the electricity in Virginia goes to data centers. Given all of that, I would have assumed that since 2006, there had been an increase in the amount of electricity we use. But until July 2nd of this year, there hadn't been, not even during peak hours. The all-time record was set 20 years ago. And that didn't happen by accident. This is a bit of a tangent, but that happened because of state policies like the Empower program in Maryland, these energy efficiency programs. These energy efficiency gains, just, the cheapest form of electricity, the easiest form of electricity is the electricity you never use, have offset all of the economic growth, all of the population growth, all of the data centers that have come onto our grid since 2006. I think that's incredible. That was a policy choice made by great states like Maryland. I'm glad we made it. I think we should keep making it. But I digress. That is not the point. We are talking about July 2nd. The point is that on that day, record electricity demand on the grid, with a caveat. Things got so bad that PJM moved beyond economic dispatch and into emergency dispatch for generators. That's technical terms, but the thing to make clear is that they did not have enough electricity. They were running out. They were pulling everything they had to pull. They had no other options. And I want to make clear, I've spent a lot of time, for those who listen to me, criticizing PJM, but the people who actually operate the grid, the people sitting at the command center making sure the lights stay on, they are absolute heroes. They must have had quite a weekend that weekend, and grateful for their service. But the control operators were doing everything they could to keep the lights on. They were pulling every lever they had. The first thing to emphasize here is that coal and gas caused this grid destabilization event. Scientists can say definitively that a heat wave of that magnitude would have been impossible before human-caused climate change. Burning coal and oil and gas caused climate change. And climate change caused that record heat, and that record heat nearly crashed our grid. So those coal and gas plants nearly crashed our grid. Of course, climate change is a global problem. Every country, every state, every individual plant could argue that their climate contribution to climate change is de minimis. And in fact, the problem was caused by everybody else. Everyone else in the world could make that argument. But literally, I think there is no one in the world who is less entitled to that argument than the people we are talking about right now, than the coal and gas plants on PJM's grid. People talk about China. China is the biggest annual greenhouse gas emitter in the world, though their emissions have been flat recently. But cumulatively, if you add up all the emissions over all of time, the United States is still the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions historically and cumulatively, greater than any other country on Earth. And for most of our history, the biggest source of our pollution has been electricity generation. And PJM is the biggest, by far the biggest, and by far the most polluting grid in our country. So the PJM grid is the biggest source of pollution from the biggest sector of pollution from the biggest country of pollution in the world. So yes, it is true that everyone can say that our contribution to climate change is just a drop in the bucket, but we have literally contributed the largest drop. So yes, it's just a drop in the bucket, but coal and gas plants on PJM deserve their fair share of blame for the heat wave we just experienced. If you live in the Maldives and your country has contributed literally 0.002% of all cumulative human-caused climate pollution, I think it's fair for you to blame other people for the fact that sea level rise is threatening your country. But if you are the most polluting energy grid in the United States, which is the biggest cumulative contributor to climate change, I think that you don't get to look at the impacts of climate change and say, we didn't do that. Those are the choices that other people made, and the choices we made had no impact on climate change. All that to say, these coal and gas plants are destabilizing PJM's reliability by contributing to climate change. But there is good news. For the most part, the grid held. Some people lost power. That is scary. It's always very scary when people lose power, but it could have been much worse because clean energy swooped in to save the day from the threat of fossil fuels. At 5 p.m. on July 2nd, solar was generating 10,000 megawatts of electricity. To give you a sense of scale, Maryland has a really big coal plant called Brandon Shores. People talk a lot about Brandon Shores, whether it's going to close, what would happen if it closed. That 10,000 megawatts of electricity is the equivalent of 7 Brandon Shores coal plants operating at full capacity and sending their electricity onto the grid. So PJM was firing on all cylinders. It didn't have an additional 7 coal plants to turn on that were sitting around waiting to be turned. Those were all the coal plants they had were operating. Some of them were not operating because they were failing. Coal and gas plants actually fail a lot during peak grid moments like extreme heat and extreme cold, but that's a different topic. We can maybe have a different episode on that. But they didn't have 7 that they could turn on that they could reach to. If those 10,000 megawatts from solar were not generating, PJM would have been in a lot of trouble. I'm not sure what they would have done. Maybe we would have had mass blackouts. It's hard to say. And I'm obviously not in that room. Information from PJM is hard to get, but what we know is they didn't have more resources to call on, and we had 10,000 megawatts of solar generating. I want to emphasize that, of course, some people did lose their power over July 4th weekend, either because of the extreme heat or because of the extreme wind that knocks down power lines. It's important to remember that losing power is life-threatening, and it's really scary for a lot of folks. So I want to honor those folks who did lose power while also recognizing that a lot more people could have lost power if it weren't for solar. And the solar was only there because states like Maryland have enacted policies like the Renewable Portfolio Standard. I want to thank Chair Brian Feldman, who helped pass that policy many, many years ago and championed the Clean Energy Jobs Act of 2019 that expanded it. Because of him and other great leaders in the Maryland General Assembly, these critical gigawatts of solar were on the grid and able to deliver. We invested in the generation sources of the 21st century, and it paid off, building critical infrastructure that functioned as the cavalry riding in to save the day in PJM's hour of need. If you enjoyed the use of electricity over the 4th of July weekend, I hope you will say a little thank you to Maryland's Renewable Portfolio Standard and all the other little renewable portfolio standards all over the PJM states because they made this possible. Despite what many state lawmakers in Maryland seem to believe, the Renewable Portfolio Standard has never been about closing coal plants. That's not what it does at all. Rather, it has always been about investing and building new electricity generation. And that generation proved critical to the grid. Renewable portfolio standards are not the reason that coal plants have been closing all across the country, in red states and in blue states. If it were state policy causing coal plants to close, they would only be closing in the blue states. But that's not what we're seeing. In 2008, the United States generated 6,233 terawatt hours of coal-generated electricity. In 2024, the United States generated 2,195 terawatt hours of electricity. In case you don't want to do the math, that is a 65% decline in national output of coal generation in the span of less than 20 years. That decline is not concentrated in blue states. It's happening everywhere because it is being driven by economics. In Pennsylvania, coal plants have been closing, including the Armstrong plant, Cheswick, Hartsfield Ferry, Bruce Manfield, and other coal plants. In Kentucky, there's the Henderson Station coal plant, the Kenneth Coleman coal plant, the Tyrene coal plant. Those have all closed. Even in West Virginia, they have seen their Willow Island coal plant close. These coal plants are closing everywhere. Even within PJM, even within the red states within PJM, these coal plants are closing because it just isn't economical. It's also worth noting that none of those coal plants were converted to any other fuel sources. They were all just simply shut down. Coal can't compete on price. It is that simple. There's all these narratives that get spun about why these coal plants are closing. It is just the more expensive option, and we live in a society where no one gravitates towards the more expensive option. So that is why no new coal plants are being built anywhere in the country right now in terms of a new coal plant. Not happen. It hasn't happened since 2013. Not even in states like West Virginia and Wyoming that heavily subsidize coal plants, and not even after Trump started showering coal plants in subsidies as well. Coal is, and I can't say this often enough, very, very expensive compared to gas and renewables. Just to put numbers on it, if you look at Lazard's, I don't know how you say that, Lazard's levelized cost of energy, and they just put out their 2026 report, they found the most affordable a coal plant can be is $71 per megawatt hour generated. There are some that are a lot more than that. That's the cheapest they can go. Compare that to, gas plant equivalent number would be $51 per megawatt hour. So that's 71 for a coal plant, 51 for a gas plant. And that's a gas combined cycle. Then, if you look at land-based wind, they cost $37 per megawatt hour, and utility scale solar is $40 per megawatt hour. So wind and solar are the cheapest. Gas comes in behind that. Coal is even farther behind that. So it's not a mystery here. Maybe I'm taking too long to say this, but it feels necessary just because there are some people out there trying to tell a very different story, at least in Maryland. I want to make clear coal is closing because it is expensive. So state policy is not forcing them to close. Economics is. Responsible state policy looks like scaling up and investing in the lowest cost, fastest to deploy energy resources, which today, thankfully, luckily, happen to be the cleanest ones, namely wind and solar, even when paired with batteries. And that's exactly what states like Maryland have done. And now we are seeing those investments pay off in tremendous dividends in the form of a more reliable grid. Coal, just to put one more note on how expensive coal is. Coal is so expensive right now that we are paying Brandon Shores hundreds of millions of dollars just to keep operating a few more years. As I described in an earlier episode, the cost of extending the lifetime of Brandon Shores just a few more years is greater than the total cost of building a battery storage facility that is capable of replacing Brandon Shores. So that really just feels like we're lighting money on fire. Now, it is true, and it's important to acknowledge, that solar is an intermittent resource. In one sense, maybe you could say we got lucky that PJM's peak demand came when solar was generating more than 10,000 megawatts of power. Though, in another sense, it wasn't really a coincidence, because PJM is a summer peaking grid, and the highest peaks on the hottest hot days come on sunny days, when everyone is, of course, running their air conditioning. If July 2nd had been a cloudy day, solar would have been generating less electricity, but there would have been less electricity demand on the grid because people use less air conditioning when it's cloudy than when it's sunny. It's also not a coincidence that the peak demand dropped as the sun started going down, because when the sun is high in the sky, people use more air conditioning. So peak demand occurs when people are using the most air conditioning, and people need the most cooling when the sun is shining. All that to say that solar is almost guaranteed to be producing energy during peak hours on the PJM grid. Once PJM catches up with other states like Texas, which has over 15,000 megawatts of batteries, that installed solar will simply become a firm energy resource that can fill up the batteries, and then the batteries can discharge. We can control that. The people at the PJM command center can control it. But for context, Texas has that 15,000 megawatts. PJM currently has just 3% of the battery capacity of Texas, despite the fact that we have a grid twice the size. So this is paltry battery deployment on behalf of PJM. Texas has figured this out. California has figured this out. For some reason, it's not happening on the PJM grid. I'll add that to one of my many gripes with the PJM management and leadership. PJM, as I like to say, is not failing us by accident. It's failing us by design. It is accountable to the for-profit voting members of this private organization. Those voting members are doing very well as electricity prices go up, even if ratepayers are not. So PJM is doing a good job of serving the people it is designed to serve. It just isn't serving the people it is not designed to serve. All that to say, we need comprehensive governance reform at PJM. That also is a topic for another day. Back to what we were talking about. Solar is saving the grid today. It is saving the grid from immediate collapse, and its ability to save the grid will only increase over time as we build more solar and as we build more batteries. But solar is actually not the only clean energy source that PJM relied on to save the grid on July 2nd. As the heat caused more conventional generation sources to trip offline, these plants, none of the infrastructure that we have is built for these extreme temperatures. In Maryland, I-97 coming out of Annapolis, the pavement buckled because of the heat. It's closed at night now, so they can fix it. If you can call it infrastructure, it was built for a given climate and a given temperature range, and we are outside of that climate and outside of that temperature range. So these big conventional power plants, there's just various parts that break down when you go to extreme temperatures like these extreme heat. So more and more generation sources were tripping offline, and PJM needed more resources. So it used this new emergent tool it has. It's been around a long time, but PJM is just catching up and using it for the first times here. They called on demand response. Demand response just means paying people to use less electricity during peak hours. So this can look like a lot of things. It can be a smart thermostat that moves just a few degrees a few days a year, or it can be a home battery system that can take the whole house off of the grid on demand. My home has solar panels and a battery, and I use software to ensure that my house never pulls from the grid during peak hours, and I get paid for doing that. And I should also say that 10,000 megawatts that I was talking so long about for solar generation, that only refers to utility scale solar generation. That's what's coming onto the grid. Well, I shouldn't say just utility scale. That only refers to in front of the meter solar generation. If you are generating solar electricity behind the meter, such that, what was happening in my house, that's not even counted in that 10,000. So all that behind the meter solar generation is on top of that 10,000 megawatts that I was referencing earlier. But back on track, I was talking about demand response. My house has demand response. It's that battery. I don't even think about it. It just happens. So on July 2nd, PJM pulled a trigger on a new demand response program, and the results were amazing. Demand response reduced electricity in PJM by another 5,000 megawatts. That's the equivalent of, if you're following the math, instantly bringing 3.5 Brandon Shores power plants onto the grid just by pushing a button. To be clear, there's no power plant anywhere. Some people call it a virtual power plant, but combined, a lot of little actions in a lot of different places add up to 5,000 megawatts. In fact, there was so much demand response, and this is the caveat I referred to earlier, PJM didn't actually break any record. Throughout this episode, I've been referencing, PJM hit this all-time demand on July 2nd, but that's not technically true. What actually happened is they hit a peak, quote, load estimate. And that just means that PJM is estimating how large demand would have been, but for using demand response measures to decrease demand. And that in terms of what actually was pulling electrons on the grid, the all-time peak demand, the reigning champion is still 2006 in terms of actual electrons pulled on the grid. But because PJM is thinking of demand response like a virtual power plant, like they're pretending it's a power plant generating 5,000 megawatts instead of energy reduction of 5,000 megawatts, which it more actually is, that means that they are using this load estimate to have this grand new total, which is the record-breaking total, even though 5,000 of it is kind of ghost demand because it wasn't there. All that to say, demand response, obviously, because it's just not using electricity, is clean energy. It worked instantaneously, and it also helped to save the grid. Because if you're keeping count, solar and demand response combined were able to deliver 15,000 megawatts of power at PJM's peak demand time. And that is the equivalent of 10 Brandon Shores coal power plants. Both solar and demand response can be scaled up enormously in a very short amount of time. Whereas there is still a 5-year waiting list just to get your hands on a new combined cycle turbine. Let's pause here and just say that again. If you want to build a new gas plant, especially a new combined cycle gas plant, you have a very long waiting list before you can even touch the turbine that you then have to start construction with. Solar can be scaled up much more quickly, and demand response can be scaled up even more quickly than that. You just need people to opt into a system. You could double this in 1 year, hypothetically. It's very possible. There aren't these physical constraints of construction, these permitting constraints that stymie almost every kind of energy we try to build in this country. These technologies, especially demand response, can be scaled very quickly. So we currently have the technology to keep the grid reliable without pollution, and it's being used right now to meet demand at peak hours. The task before us is just to scale these solutions. If we do that, we can lower the cost of the PJM capacity auction and actually bring electricity prices down. Not just stop the increase, but bring them down if we do this sufficiently. This all makes the argument that I hear a lot of Republicans make in Maryland that, energy prices are high because coal plants, because we don't have enough coal, because we're closing coal plants. It all just feels ridiculous. We have 21st century technology. Why are you arguing about a 19th century technology? We should be building more of what's newer and better instead of digging down on failed technologies and stomping your feet just because your preferred energy solution didn't win in the market. It really honestly gets me worked up, but we're moving on because that's another tangent. So PJM, for the most part, withstood this heat wave. Of course, I should caveat, it is very possible there will be an even more intense heat wave caused by climate change that will come along and surpass PJM's capacity even with demand response and solar and cause widespread blackouts. That would be a terrible outcome, and by no means today do I mean to say that's not going to happen. That could absolutely still happen. We need more generation, and the best way to prevent that blackout is to deploy as much solar, as much demand response, as many batteries, and as much onshore wind as humanly possible, as quickly as possible. And again, not only are those the lowest cost forms of energy, they are also the cleanest. So they're the ones that are not going to contribute even more to the extreme weather events that are causing these grid stabilization events. It does us no good whatsoever to try to build a gas plant that won't come online until the mid-2030s, when the grid is straining to meet demand right now. Now that we have seen it work in real-world conditions, PJM, as I said, could greatly expand this demand response program in the next 365 days. Today, it just is the reality that the fastest, cheapest way to deploy new, reliable energy is with solar, demand response, batteries, and wind. But not every elected official in Maryland has internalized that new reality, and certainly not every Maryland resident has internalized it. So that brings me back to the even more exciting thing, in my opinion, that happened on July 8th. On that day, a group of Maryland leaders came together to launch a new effort called Bright Future Maryland, whose mission is to educate every elected official in Maryland, every candidate in Maryland, and every person in Maryland about this new reality, to make sure that our knowledge is catching up to the technology and the possibilities that it has made possible. So less than a week after solar and demand response saved the PJM grid, Maryland leaders met at Henderson Hopkins Elementary School. It's a school that is lowering its energy bills and the bills of its neighbors with community solar on its roof. And it is also the same school where Governor Moore issued his terrific executive order establishing Maryland's zero-emission heating equipment standard and our clean heat standard. So on that same stage, at that same school, lowering prices through solar, the leaders of Maryland were meeting that morning to announce the creation of Bright Future Maryland. This is a special collaboration between heavy hitters in the energy space to make sure that all of us internalize this new reality. Bright Future Maryland has even developed a blueprint for how to reduce energy burdens in the state by building on these incredible new technologies. If you're interested in seeing that platform, I can link to the Bright Future Maryland website, because we know the more clean energy we build, the lower our energy costs will be. And the more we rein in utility spending, the lower our energy costs will be. The more we make data centers pay for everything that they are costing us, the lower our energy costs will be. And the more we expand access to efficient, healthy electric homes, the lower our energy bills will be. Bright Future Maryland is going to be holding events throughout the state this fall. We're going to be requesting meetings with every candidate. We're going to be sharing this good news. It is very exciting stuff. And the energy world has fundamentally changed in just a few years. We're going to make sure everybody knows it. I'll put it in the link, but the website is www.brightfuturemaryland.com with Maryland spelled out. During the record heat waves this summer, like the one on July 2nd, solar and demand response saved the grid. These technologies are now proving that they can operate as critical infrastructure, and I think that we should build more of the lowest cost, fastest to deploy, cleanest energy options, and not more of the more expensive, more polluting, and slower to build alternatives like methane gas. That's what Bright Future Maryland is here to say, and I hope some people are going to listen. This is also my very first video. As you may be able to tell, I have mostly been exclusively been a podcast before this. Let me know if you think a video is a nice thing or if we should stick to audio. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening.